Peace, peace, peace. I am Dr. Philip Roundtree, and you are tuned into episode 65 of the hashtag You Good Man podcast. Today, we'll be talking about navigating death, dying, and grief as men. As always, I'm joined by the good Canadian homie, and that's what I'm going to say now. I'm going to say you're a Canadian brother. Michael Olenek. How you been, family?
I have I'm no borders here, man. I'm a no borders person. I'm just
No.
I'm
So,
doing
so
good,
you, so have you applied for like Canadian citizenship?
Nah, at this point, I'm going work visa to work visa, so it's just a
Okay.
temporary. So as long as I
Okay.
got the work visa, I'm good.
Okay, so how does that work? Do they give you like a specific time frame? Because I watched 90 Day Fiance, and I know they for the K1 visa to get somebody over here. I think they come over and then they got 90 days to either get married or they got to leave. So
Okay. So
is
I
it something
needed the
similar?
work visa to enter the country. I
Okay,
needed it to come in, and then
okay.
it was for exactly a year. It's running out. I'm not going to say when it's running out because it's being recorded right now.
Word, word,
But we're
word,
we're up against it.
word. And what's the prime minister name? Trudeau? Is it Justin Trudeau or something
Trudeau,
like
yeah,
that?
Trudeau,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. We don't want him coming to get you. We don't want him coming
Nah, I
coming
think
to
he's
get
got
you.
bigger things to worry about right now. We
Word,
don't need it.
word. So we're gonna have this conversation, and I want to let people know the impetus for this conversation. When you logged on, you was like, "Death, dying, and grief, man," and it was just like, "Yeah, yeah, like this is where I'm at." Especially within the last week or so. So initially, it started out as it's just something that took place within the last few weeks or so. So I've been navigating this sort of like community loss, and I'm sure you'll be able to empathize, and hopefully the listeners are able to empathize as well. And I always want to shout you all out for listening and watching, whether you're listening and watching on YouTube or whatever streaming service you're using. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. But for me, it really started out as this community loss. So here in Philadelphia, a disgraced cop by the name of Mark Dial murdered 27-year-old Eddie Irizarry. This happened 2 weeks ago here in Philadelphia. If you follow me on socials, Phil_Roundtree, I've posted about it on every platform that I'm on, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. I've literally posted it everywhere. I think when we talk about state-sanctioned murders that have taken place since I've been on social media, this is the one that's hit home most, and I'm not sure why, and hopefully we'll be able to unpack that, and I'll have a better understanding as to why. It was especially egregious due to the police commissioner. So here, the police commissioner Outlaw, she provided false information. She provided false information stating that Eddie lunged at the officers after being pulled over. And then details came out and video came out. And so not only did Eddie not lunge at the officers with knives, Eddie never got out the motherfucking car. The video shows, again, this coward, Mark Dial. Now, Eddie did go down a one-way street, which I've done. I've done that down Temple University, where it's just one way after one way, and it's just like, oh shit. Now you hoping like, okay, let me get to the end of the one way, so I can then get back on the right path. But I never was stopped by the police, and it never ended up with my murder. Hence the reason why I'm here today. So what we see in the video is that Eddie goes down this one-way street. Now they try to say that he was driving erratic. Of course they're going to say that. Right? Of course they're going to say that. So we see him come down the street. We see him stop. We see him back up. We then see the car driven by the coward Mark Dial, who has since been suspended because he's not obliging his superiors by participating in the ongoing investigation. So they're calling it insubordination. We see him drive up. We see the vehicle stop. We see him get out. We see him shoot and kill Eddie Irizarry while he's still sitting in his car with the door closed. And when I watched that, I said, wait. And this is before I saw it being reported in the news about what had taken place and with regards to the video. I said, damn, that was kind of fast. And I replayed it and I counted, and it was, he parked one, two, three, four, five, and Eddie was murdered. And so in watching that video, I ingested that trauma. Now, what I did with that trauma that I had just ingested, I used it to promote Eddie's story and what had taken place, and to call out the Philadelphia Police Department, to call out public officials here in Philadelphia who I haven't seen say a word with regards to it. Maybe because it's election season coming up, right? Who knows? But all I know is that it had an impact on me. And so I felt the tension, I felt unsettled, I felt helplessness, I felt anger, I felt sadness, all these characteristics of grief that accompany death, especially state sanctioned murders. And so the second reason I wanted to have this conversation was it was wild. One day last week, I met with a sister. Well, I met a sister who shared the same birthday with my brother, who has now been an ancestor for the last 22 years. Later that day, his first love messaged me on TikTok, and she told me, she said, Phil, I'm so proud of you. And I immediately knew it was her when I saw the name Laura. I was just like, yeah, I know who you are, right? You took me to see Dennis the Menace when I was 8. Haven't seen her and heard from her in the last 30 some odd years, right? Because my brother went on to go and date other people. She went on to go become a nurse and live her dreams. But with that, it had me reflecting. It had me feeling all the feels and feeling all the emotions related to my brother. And so, although I'm not necessarily grieving his death, I know I'll be experiencing grief until my last breath. And so these two situations had me consider for the first time in a while just how men understand death, dying, and grief. Hence the reason why, I wanted to have this conversation. And so for you, Mike, I want to start it off by asking, what's your experience and understanding of death, dying, and grief?
Well, so first on I saw the video of the state-sanctioned murder, and I too thought that was really fast, really fast. And you could see the fear in the officer. That officer had no confidence, like ran away after firing.
Ran away.
Like ran away. And what I felt in that moment was just this deep hurt for like the system that we live in, that this kind of a situation can happen on such a consistent basis in the US. That we continue to put people who don't have the ability to be calm in situations of crisis with weapons. And yeah, it's heavy. I have feelings about cops. I have feelings about all of that. Like, we had a whole movement there for a little bit where we were talking about defund the police. That got crushed real fast. No one's talking about defund the police anymore.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Nobody's talking about that. No, we're talking about, like, we're basically back in the good old days of like law and order. They're just not saying that, but that's what we're pushing towards.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like you always say, state sanctioned murder. That's what that is. There's no other way of looking at it. As far as like processing grief and death and dying, for me personally, I feel pretty okay with death and that kind of loss. I feel like I sit with it well. I understand it. But there's like death of the spirit. I'm going to try to tie this together with something that I experienced over the last week where, Phil, I've brought psychedelics into my life, right? And
Yeah.
I took a macro dose of mushrooms last week, 3.5 grams, and it was possibly the most healing experience of my life. I'm talking real inner child work. I really sat with my family dynamic. I sat with the lack of care I received, like that aspect of death, not being able to access who I was because of like trauma, right?
Hmm.
And I'm talking at the end of the night, I wept for 25 minutes. Wept because I really
Wow.
felt it finally. Like
Yeah.
I felt that loss, right? And then we're talking about death. The thing that's hard to grapple with is loss. It feels like this thing that you can never put back together again. But that was probably the closest I've been to really sitting with grief and allowing the actual physical reaction to grief to really happen. Because I don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I feel that. So when I think about my brother specifically, I think the purest moment that I was grieving and I just allowed myself to experience all the feels, all the emotions was when my mother first told me, when she came down the stairs and said, "Phil, Bobby died." And all those emotions came pouring out. I didn't think about how I might look. And I was 17 at the time. I didn't care about how I would look. I was in a safe space with my mother, and so the tears just came out. But that was it, right? That hour, that 2 hour after learning that he had died, because shortly thereafter, later that evening, I went down South Street in Philly, and I always talk about it. I got a "Rest in Peace Bobby" tattoo on my arm because that's what I've been conditioned to believe is what you do when you experience loss, especially as a black man. So I went down South Street with my homegirl Amy, who had a really high pitched voice like Michelet. For those of you who are familiar with the singer Michelet, we went down there. I got the tattoo, and it was just like, oh, okay, everything is supposed to be hunky dory at this point. I went to school that Monday, and what happened? I got suspended for cussing out the computer teacher. I talk about this in the TEDx talk that I did, because for some reason, and not for necessarily for some reason, because we recognize how the conversation or the lack thereof that we have in this country, in the black community, when it comes to death, dying, and grief. It's not one. You give it to Jesus. They're in a better place now. But nobody says, okay, don't go to school,
Mm.
because it's always supposed to be business as usual. And this isn't just endemic to black folk. This is just endemic. Again, we have this conversation about producing. You always have to produce. So for me at 17 was getting this tattoo. Why? Because I didn't drink at the time, so it wasn't pouring out liquor for my fallen homies, for my fallen brother. It was to go to school and try to get this education, which in one hand is noble. The fact that I had the ability to get up, to go and attempt to achieve, which is when we talk about men and how they cope with death, we can become workaholics. But for me, I took this pain, I took this grief and went to school, but I hadn't processed it, and what that manifested in me cursing out the computer teacher for no reason. Right now, in subsequent years after that, I was able to see Miss Williams, and she understood, and we hugged, and it was love. But me processing his loss was through anger and rage, and I didn't just stop there. At that point, that's how I would use that to anger and rage to navigate anytime I experience extreme discomfort, extreme pain, extreme loss. We know that with men, and we talk about this idea of depression, it's not necessarily about laying in bed for 4 and 5 days on end because you experience the death. No, it's anger. You're going through that grieving process. So when we bring up this idea of just navigating it and the difficulties, because like any and everything, these are learned behaviors. These are learned characteristics. My daughter, who you heard on the phone, asking me to get her some McDonald's and say, please, please, please. She hasn't experienced death yet. Maybe from a small way when her fish died, right? But she hasn't experienced death and loss. In full transparency, I haven't attempted to prepare her for what needs to take place when loss happens. because that's just not necessarily what we do as a society. So it just brings up, when you talk about just grieving and bringing up those emotions, I'm sure it's still pain, it's still hurt. As I said, I may not be actively grieving, but I'll be navigating this grief when it comes to my brother for the rest of my life, and it may come up in moments. When I did defended my dissertation, it came up. I had sat and wrote this entire dissertation with 20 pages, 15, 20 pages dedicated to him, and I was cool as a fan. Cognitively, I was able to understand it. Listen, you know what? Unfortunately, he died from opioid use, Xanax, Percocets, codeine, something that's only getting now being talked about because white folk are dying from it, right? Because what's happening in Kensington, I don't need to watch the Painkillers movie. I experienced that in 2020 in 2001. I understand when I saw the prescription bottles where these were coming from, right? But ultimately, I'm gonna be navigating this, and so yeah, there is probably some stored grief in store. But for so many of us, for all of us, really, we're always going to be navigating grief as long as we're alive.
Well, yeah, and you hit on this a little bit. Like the way we handle death, the way we handle dying as a society is out of sight, out of mind. Like, how do we handle, like, I remember, this is kind of, I remember when I was in third grade, we had hamsters, right? And they had babies. And then I proceeded to watch the mom eat the babies. And at the time, my dad was like, she's cleaning them. And I was like, that's not what's happening, right? So, but like, that's a good, like, we don't spend time discussing the prospect of death when we all know it is a part of our lives.
Yeah.
We don't have resources to have that conversation. And then like on the prospect of dying, I mean, I think just look at how we're just now getting into a state of really using palliative care and end of life care. Like we used to just like prop people up for as long as possible, but now we're like, no, okay, you have a terminal illness and you want to end your life. Okay, here, we'll set that up for you so that you can like greet your family and your friends one last time, like, and make meaning. And then when you talk about the grief, yeah, I mean, I have a close friend who died of a heroin overdose going on 10 years ago, I want to say. But I had like, that one hurt, right? I carried his casket. I cried. I still think about him and I still feel a wound, right? And I think that's what you're getting at with your brother, is that just because we've had a grieving moment doesn't mean the grief isn't going to show up again. And I think this might be kind of like something that men really struggle with, is that we think it's a one and done thing a lot of times, men. We're like, oh, I did that. I'm good. I'm golden. I figured it out. But that grief's going to show up again. It's going to grab you. I have, as I've aged and as I've done work on myself, I have gotten a lot better at being present with that loss. Because I had another friend probably about a month and a half ago overdose and die, and that one stung a lot too. But the next day after finding out about it, I had that breaking point. I had that point where I allowed myself to weep, where I allowed myself to feel and be present with that feeling and hold myself.
Yeah.
I think the good thing about that is if you can learn to be present with grief, you get a really good chance to really sit with yourself and care for yourself and allow space for yourself without the necessary support. Yes, we want support when we're dealing with death or dying, but I still think we need to refine those skills on our own too.
For sure. When I hear you talk about your friend and just the difficulties, they're just the myriad of emotions that come from that. When I think about me going to school that 2 days later, right, and trying to show strength, and there is a level of strength that is present there, again, just by getting up and still pushing forward. But there's also a strength in sitting and resting and being present and attempting to process what you're feeling. But we use the skills that we have.
Mm-hmm.
We use the skills that we have. When I think about, for me, and this idea, part of going to school was, part of that was protection. Not only protecting myself, but also protecting my mother, who had just lost her eldest son. Because she can't have two children. She can't have one child that's passed away, and then another child who's grieving beyond belief because they just lost a intimate relationship, being my brother. So I had to be, again, quote unquote, strong. I had to protect my mother in that instance, right? And so part of it, in reflection, part of it was like, you know what? There may be a little bit of guilt if I didn't do that, if I didn't get up. When I think about friends who, I've had some friends that I've lost, it's just like that idea of guilt that comes in, that we all experience, but especially men, and this notion that we're protectors. And now here we are, we couldn't protect this individual from dying. I couldn't protect my brother from dying. You couldn't necessarily protect your friend from overdosing. And part of that starts to seep in just because of how we're conditioned to be as men.
Yeah, I could definitely see how we're taught to show up and help others, right? Put your stuff to the side, be strong, stand tall. Um, so the friend that just died a month and a half ago, me and him used to talk about suicide a lot because we both have had periods of active suicidal ideation where it's just, for anyone that doesn't know, like, that's just like living every day, and the serious thought of wanting to kill yourself is there. It's present. It's with you. It hangs around. Doesn't mean I'm sitting there actively pursuing it, but the option's on the table, and on the table in a serious way. And me and him used to talk about it a lot. And when I found out he passed, a big part of me hoped that it was an intentional overdose. Like, that's the conclusion I came. When you're talking about like working through guilt, like, that's the place I ended up. I wanted it to be intentional. I wanted him to have made the choice to be like, yeah, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
I'm tired and I want out. Because for some reason, that felt so much better than an accidental overdose. It just felt better. but that's exactly what you're talking about. Like, that, the mental gymnastics we do when we're handling something that's as heavy as losing somebody, especially abruptly. Abrupt deaths are hard. You don't see them, and then they're there, and then the person's gone.
Yeah.
And you're left with all those things to figure out.
Yeah. And the reason why I chuckle is because I did the exact same thing with my brother. It was shameful to say that he died from codeine or from Xanax or from Percocets and having sleep apnea to where he already had an irregular heartbeat. So now when he's taking these sedatives, it causes it to stop. It was shameful to tell people that. Right? Now it's okay. We're having more of a public discourse when it comes to, and only specifically opioid use, because it's still shame if you say, hey, somebody uses crack cocaine. We still look at them a certain type of way. You're a crackhead, right? We have certain language that we attribute to that, which again, it's very shameful. With my brother, I used to tell people that he got shot. And I did that for the longest time, because what that did was that took the responsibility out of his hands and placed it on another, probably somebody that looks like him, right? But it's a little bit more honorable to die that way, as opposed to you took these drugs that you didn't necessarily need. You probably needed potentially some other types of drugs to navigate, hurt, pain, navigate mental health, depression, anxiety, what have you. But you took these to cope. And it cost you your life. And I literally did that for 5 or 6 years. I would just tell people that, because it was not only easier for me to say that so people could just leave it alone, but it made it easier for me to process the loss, to process what took place. And now I'm at a place where I say, yeah, he died from opioid use, from, using whatever he was using. Say, oh, I'm sorry for your loss. And I say, well, he made decisions. He made choices, and it's not to to speak as if, just a laissez-faire attitude, but I've recognized when we make decisions, our decisions potentially have consequences, and he didn't necessarily think that his consequence was going to be to lose his life and impact so many people around him, because I doubt that that's what he would have chose. But also I do recognize that the decisions that we make, they impact individuals. So when I was going through my suicidal ideations, it was much easier for me to navigate that through the first, from age 17 to 24, because then my daughter came, right? And it became a lot more difficult potentially to reconcile me not being here anymore. You know what I'm saying? And so for that, it was, you know what? Hey, this is the game. And so for me, even saying it, using that type of language, it's just like, yo, you're just so callous with it. And it's just like, no. Because I understand the hurt, the pain, the trauma, and everything that comes with decision making. And that's why it informs me. It informs my own. This can't hurt his legacy. He was an amazing brother in moments. In some moments, he was a JA. You know what I mean? He was a jack off. Right? It's just what it is, but that's what made him him. And that's what made him special to me. This relationship that was beginning to build prior to his loss, right? Because he was 8 years older than me. But that hurt and that pain, it wouldn't allow me to speak truth to power. So in essence, I gave it away. It wasn't until I reclaimed that power and talked about what exactly happened. It's that old Eminem line from 8 Mile where he allows the rapper to either he raps first, and he says everything that the rapper is going to say about him. Because then once I reclaim my power, it's nothing that you can say at this point, right? So it's no need for me to lie about how he died, because I'm fine. I've done that work. I've reconciled that loss for now. Because again, it might be different 15 minutes from now.
And I guess the thing that's coming to my head is there an honorable way to die? Like, and I keep also thinking about how death is both personal and communal, right?
Yeah.
It gets filtered through both, because like I'm thinking about like June 21 till January 22, I pretty much wanted to kill myself every single day, right? And that was a decision that I was carrying as a burden. So I was kind of plotting my own death as an escape raft, right? It was, I don't have to feel this anymore if I do this. And traveling that, I think, was in a way a grieving process. Like, I was in the depths of grief as like mental health stuff was coming up, going through a separation, going through a divorce. You talked about your daughter. My cat Albert's the only reason I'm alive. I'm dead serious. There was a day where in my session with my therapist, Ren.
Yeah, and them.
Ren is one of the best people that ever entered my life. Love you. But there was a therapy session where I said I was going to take Albert to stay with someone. And she paused and she said, "What was that?" I was like, "I'm going to take Albert. He's going to stay somewhere else for the weekend." She's like, "Well, the thing is Albert's keeping you alive, so I don't like hearing that." And that moment really put me in that place of like, do I want to end this, right?
Yeah.
Is the grief at a point where I truly don't think there's a good day ahead of me? Can I still enjoy the breeze next week? Can I still enjoy the way the sun feels? That's where I was, right? And I think when we're holding grief from death of others, we're going through that same kind of process. We're sitting there and we're thinking, how am I going to ever feel better than this? How am I going to move this weight that's sitting on my chest? How am I going to continue to function when I feel like someone's been robbed from me? I think it's a combination of what we're talking about, both being at rest and being in process of some kind. Like, you going to school was absolutely necessary. It's the thing that like held you up and gave you purpose and gave you meaning. And we need that when we're dealing with death and dying. We just also need to, everyone needs this, but men especially need time to actually sit and feel, not process, not analyze, feel, have the physical reaction where your body says it's time to be still and it's time to weep.
Hmm.
It's time to just step into the pain that you're refusing to feel.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw this quote that said, when men mourn, they turn inwards. When women mourn, they turn outwards. And that resonated for me. And granted, of course, this isn't an end all. This isn't speaking about every man, every woman, right? But for me, that's exactly what it is. I've always preferred solitude. I always get caught up in my mind. It's exhausting. I was on a podcast of a homie, and he was talking about, he never comments on my poster because he's just like, it'd be so much there, and it had me thinking, like, it must be exhausting to be in your head. And I said, for sure, for sure, because I'm always inward. I'm always inside. I'm always thinking about outcomes, hopefully solutions as well. But I'm always inconsistently processing, and it's extremely exhausting. Right? It's extremely
Agreed.
exhausting. And so, but I know when I've experienced mourning, in death and dying, when my father died, with that might have been the healthiest grieving that I've done. I mourned the loss of somebody with whom I was I didn't know, but I had started to get to know and to understand and to accept their how they had to navigate life and the choices and the decisions that they made. So when he died, it was definitely shed some tears. Right? It's not the Jay-Z pops died, didn't cry, didn't know him that well. No, I definitely shed some tears. And I allowed myself space because I had something to go off of, because I saw how I grieved when my brother died, which at the time I did the best I could with what I had. But several years later, I had more information. I had more better knowledge of self. And so I took the time. You know what? I'm going to use this week off from work to grieve. Now, did I go play basketball? I'm sure I did. Did I go to the gym? Did I go do all of these different things? Yeah, but I didn't have to bombard myself with stressors and pressures and be a workaholic to try and navigate the loss of such a pivotal figure in my life. And as we go forward, hopefully when I experience more loss and more death, because it's inevitable, right?
Mm-hmm.
They coming for you. It's like, it was death and taxes. Those are the only two things that you cannot avoid. And so hopefully I've acquired the skills to help me navigate this. But the main thing is trusting myself. Can I trust myself in this process? Can I trust myself that I have the skills needed to navigate all of this? There's going to be some days where it's heavier than others. Do I trust myself in navigating with that? And then if I do have a moment where it may not be the healthiest, am I going to accept that and forgive myself and show myself love and grace and compassion? Because that's what's needed when we talk about grieving and navigating grief.
Yeah, compassion is, I feel like that's the theme on this pod lately when we're talking about men having to find compassion. And when you talk about the difference between men and women, one being inward and the other being outward, I can't help but think that absolutely has to do with like conditioning, right? Because let's think about outward mourning. Outward mourning is dramatic.
Oh, of course,
It's
yeah.
sometimes loud.
Oh
It's
my gosh.
it's
Yeah.
messy. It's it's someone allowing themselves to completely and totally fall apart, right? You are going completely with the feeling of the moment. You are
Yeah.
not controlling, you are not executing. No, you are becoming a mess and you're allowing that mess to fall out of you. I was taught all my life to never be dramatic, to never get messy, to never lose my footing. No, I need to be solid. And I too, like you, I remember in high school, we just had a lot of kids die. There was a couple suicides, there was a terrible car crash, and I remember always being stoic with it.
Hmm.
Just like, it doesn't phase me. Yeah, they're gone. Whatever. That's what happens. And I got to think, is that stoicism helpful sometimes? Like, do we need that stoicism in our community? Like, can everybody be a mess? Is basically what I'm getting at here. It's like, with grief, can everybody be falling apart? Or do we need people to be in there in the mix that are more steady, more grounded, more with the feeling, but not letting the feeling dictate, instead being with the feeling and moving with it? You know what I mean?
I do. I do. That's an interesting question that you pose before we get to just some strategies for coping with death, dying, and grief. It's interesting. No, we can't have everybody fall apart. We have mechanisms in place that stop that. It's called jobs, right? It's called
There's
employment.
capitalism.
Exactly. It's called capitalism. I think about I worked in child welfare, and an old head of mine, Ali Malik, God bless the dead, an ancestor. He took his life. Unfortunately, he took somebody else's life along with his, and we had to go back to work. We worked together. He was a supervisor. Everybody knew. And yes, they had people come in to have conversations, to talk about it, and to try and process it. But none of us should have been there the next day. Not if we care about one another. Not if we care about this process of grieving. Not if we care about the work that we're doing as being police adjacent. Right? Even if we just cared about the work, something should have said, no, you know what? Folk are not going to be able to work at optimal levels, especially those with whom he was close to, right? His
Also,
unit.
like bringing grief counseling into the space where the person existed. Like, what do we do? We're dancing in their tomb. Like, what? How are we supposed to heal in that space?
Yeah, yeah. I think about that often. Here in Philadelphia is a school, Boys Latin, where they've had several of their students. It's a high school. They've had several of their students die from gun violence, and I know I've gone to the school and to have conversations and to help these young brothers process. It's not even just to provide a safe space for them to express themselves. But when I think about in that situation, I think about any other space that they may inhabit probably won't be safe enough for them to be able to express themselves in that way. Right. So I see the pros of it, but I also see the cons. Right. Where, okay, in that situation at DHS, yeah, that didn't need to take place there. Right. And for what, an hour, then we go back to work?
Yeah.
What are we doing here? Needs to be something that's, what about the individual who doesn't want to take advantage of it for that moment in time? Oh, I know. Then they have to go and use their what is it, 13, what is it called, where you get to see a therapist 13 free times. Right. You got to go and use that, because then what'll happen if it takes more than 13? Then we need insurance clearance to help you process that, to help you navigate that. Again, capitalism has fucked up grieving, right? Has fucked up death and dying. And so, but yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point when we talk about some of these spaces and where we attempt to process grief. It shouldn't be, right? That shouldn't be the location for that to take place.
Yeah. And I'm just with you on this idea of like how capitalism speeds up the process of grief, right? Because that is true. Like, you might have some things happen and you might get a day, like you'll get some bereavement, but listen, if you're lucky, you'll get bereavement.
If you're
If
lucky.
you're lucky.
Yeah, because it has to be what, a significant relationship, right? It has to be.
Correct.
You have to be related.
There you go. And there's another problem, like the hierarchical of needs when it comes to actually being allowed to mourn. Oh, I'm sorry, you weren't close enough to them. It wasn't direct family, so sorry, you're not getting a day off for that.
Yeah.
Like, it makes us callous towards death. So not only are we not talking about death, but we're not actually allowing it to exist in its whole form.
Hmm.
We're just brushing it under the rug. Keep it moving.
Yeah.
Keep it moving.
Yeah. Yeah. It's nasty, man. It's nasty. So when we talk about just strategies for helping men, helping brothers cope, my automatic go to, and we've talked about it, and I utilize it often. Probably I wish I used it more. Was just crying.
Mm.
Just crying. It's I watch a lot of television somehow. I have no idea where I get all this television in. But when I'm watching these I'm watching a lot of these shows, and it's moments where I'm just like the tears just come out. Where I just feel, right? Because whether I can relate personally to what's taking place, or it's just something that taps into to my emotional being, which is wasn't always the case, right? But that wasn't always the case with me, where it was just like, you shouldn't be crying over this. Now it's no. If it's gonna come, it's gonna come. If I watch a Wendy's commercial and something happen, and it's just like, damn, man, it brings out a tear, that I'm gonna let that come, because what I don't want to do is to stop myself and then something, and then I neuter myself from this ability to cry, to express emotion. So definitely being able to cry and feel one's emotions. What about you? What's the strategy that
I
that
mean, I'm gonna
that
jump
you're
on
big on?
the tears train here, and just like agree that crying is new for me, right? I was an expert, still can be, at just the second I feel that slight choke in the back of my throat, I shut it down.
Mm.
I crush it. I eliminate the threat. I just sit there with it long enough that it can't make it all the way up into my heart or wherever the tear comes from. Uh, and I just shut it down. But I'm thinking now, and probably the first time I really allowed myself to get sneak attacked by tears was watching Pose.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
The very
yeah.
first season of Pose, and it was it it that show allowed me to feel in a way and connect to stories and connect to like real human emotion and real human grief in a way that I've never been able to before. And then we move it up to today. Yo, I hope I cry like last week sometime soon.
Hmm.
Like, I hope I have that kind of cathartic release. Man, it's human. It's primal, even. It is animal. That, like, animals cry when they're, like, wounded, right? They make noise. We should also make noise. And I think that is a good message to send to men. When you feel those tears coming, let them happen.
Yeah.
Like, let it happen. Let yourself break open a little bit. Let your soul open up. Let those feelings that feel too big to happen. And then you'll realize, oh, wait, that felt kind of good. I
Yeah,
enjoyed
exactly.
that.
Exactly. For me, it's the season finale of The Office, which on Comedy Central, it's just like literally like every 3 weeks, because they run through that show often. I'm here for it every single episode. But Andy says, I wish there was a way to know that you're in the good old days before they become the good old days.
Mm,
And it's real, right? It's just like, yo, I've had this experience. Um, and 10 years from now, it's not going to be here anymore,
mm.
right? And I wish I was able to be present in that moment to fully understand just how important and valuable it was to who I am and who I've become, who I've grown to be. So
No,
yeah.
and I think that's a good point to make because on the other side of death is life. So like living's important too. Like you want to handle death well, be present in your life. Be soaking up these relationships. And I think the main thing that you need for that to be possible is you do need to uncork that emotional like stuff down that you've been working on for years to all the men out there. Like that needs to be uncorked or else you can't get that kind of life. You
Yeah.
just can't. You can't love openly honestly while being emotionally cut off. You can't. And
Word.
without love, I don't know if we feel death. We don't feel death in the same way, do
E-
we? So,
Exactly, exactly, and is the fact that you brought up uncorked because it goes to this idea that we know a lot of men, when they're experiencing death, dying in grief, they may turn to alcohol, they may
mm,
turn to drugs. We know that an increase happens during this period of bereavement, and so the one thing that you don't want to do is say, "Hey, you're drinking too much." Right, you don't want to come at it from that perspective, right? Like, oh my gosh, you're drinking so much. What, it's because we recognize that, hey, somebody just died, they just lost somebody close to them. So if you're going to support somebody, you want to make sure that you're not judgmental in your approach, right? Yeah, we can address the alcohol, but what's most important is understanding the reason behind it. And so
yeah,
addressing, not addressing the response, but the underlying symptom that's causing the response is super critical. I know for so many brothers who I know personally and I see throughout social media, is if somebody does, yo, let's go get a drink in memory of when my homie, one of my former closest friends, his dad had died. It was just like, we're going to all get together and we're going to celebrate Mr. Kenny life. We're going to drink. We're going to get fried. Right? Now, some people may continue on and further indulge as a result of that. But it's so important to recognize the reasoning behind it. Because
mm,
that's what you're going to ultimately have. If you want to stop that behavior, you're going to have to address what's happening underneath.
yeah. And grief isn't a one size fits all kind of thing.
Exactly.
Grief is individual. Grief is personal. Grief can look like a lot of things. It's just, I think what we're getting at is it has to look like something. It has to exist.
Yeah.
If you're a man and you're out there and you're in your 30s and you've never allowed yourself to experience grief, I can guarantee you that there's a lot of grief sitting in your body.
Yeah.
There's just no way. You can't make it to 30 without experiencing grief. You just can't.
Yeah.
Someone died, someone's passed on, you've experienced some kind of tragedy. And if you've never sat in it, you're missing out.
Yeah. And
As, as weird as that sounds, you're
no.
missing out. Grief is an important experience as a human.
And the fact is, it's manifested itself some way, somehow.
Mm.
Now, whether you want to acknowledge it or not is something different. So whether you start working more hours, you start looking at your little more sensitive, right? When it comes to how people are talking to you, you're it's a hair trigger on your emotions, and you're lashing out at people. It's visible. Because again, yeah, that inward hurt, that inward pain has to come out some way, somehow. Even if it's, you might not see it until later because you might be taking 4, 5, 6, 10 years off your life expectancy. So it's going to manifest itself some way or somehow. You just want to do it in a way that's ideally as healthy as possible.
Yeah. And it's
Word.
like, I feel like every pod we're saying this similar thing, which is just that there's something in you that you're feeling that needs to be felt. And your body's going to keep reminding you until you finally feel it. It will show up. It just will.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, how can the people reach you?
Still only on IG. Sisyphus and absurdity. But yeah, not much going on right now. Just looking for a job, doing
Word.
pods on
Word.
the side.
Word. If you in Canada, what part of Canada you in? Calgary, Alberta.
Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Halifax. Okay. Well, I still only acknowledge Calgary, Alberta, because that's where Bret Hart and Owen Hart and the Hart Foundation are from. That's the only one that I know of, and I think Drake is from.
All the respect to the Hearts.
Exactly. And as always, you can catch me, Phil_Roundtree, across all social media. I'm gonna try and point what side is the little subscribe button on. You can't. It's on Mike's side. So hit the subscribe button, like, comment. They get spicy in the YouTube comments. They get spicy over there. But I appreciate it though, because I'm gonna go back full blown. I mean, I'm gonna return the energy. But as always, I definitely appreciate you, Mike, coming through. I appreciate y'all who are tuned in. Until next week, peace.